January 17, 1945. Luzon, Philippines. The rain had not stopped for 3 days. It drummed against the corrugated metal roof of the barracks with a rhythm that felt like the heartbeat of something dying. Inside, 23 women sat on wooden pallets, their backs against damp walls, their eyes fixed on nothing. The air smelled of mildew, unwashed bodies, and the faint metallic tang of fear. They had learned not to speak during the day. Speaking drew attention. Attention brought violence. Outside, the sound of boots on gravel. Heavy, deliberate. American boots. The women had been told what would happen when the Americans came. They had been told for months in whispers and shouts, in careful propaganda and careless threats. The Imperial Japanese Army had made it clear. The White Devils would rape them, torture them, parade them through streets as trophies of war. Better to die with honor, they were told. Better to take your own life than face what was coming. Some of the women had been given cyanide capsules. Others had been shown how to tie a noose. The guards had left 2 days ago, vanishing into the jungle with whatever they could carry, abandoning the women to whatever fate the Americans would bring. And now that fate was here. The door opened. Light spilled across the floor, pale and gray through the rain. A silhouette filled the doorway. Broad shoulders, rifle slung across the back, helmet dark against the storm. The women pressed themselves against the walls, some covering their faces, others simply closing their eyes. One began to pray in a whisper. Another bit down on her hand to keep from screaming. The American soldier stepped inside. He was young, maybe 22, with mud caked on his trousers and a face that looked like it hadn't slept in a week. He stopped just past the threshold, water dripping from his helmet, and looked at them. His eyes moved from face to face, and something in his expression changed. It wasn't hunger. It wasn't rage. It was something the women had not expected, something they had not been prepared for. It was shock. He turned his head and called over his shoulder in English, words the women didn't understand. More soldiers appeared behind him, 5, then 8, then a dozen. They crowded at the entrance, staring, and one of them, a tall man with red hair and freckles, took off his helmet and held it against his chest like he'd just walked into a church. Another soldier, darker-skinned with kind eyes, said something soft and low, and the first soldier nodded. Then he did something incomprehensible. He smiled. Not a predatory smile, not a cruel smile. A sad, gentle smile, the kind you give to a frightened animal. He raised both hands, palms out, and took a step back toward the door. He said something in English, his voice calm and measured, and then he gestured behind him. The women didn't move. They had been taught not to trust gestures. Gestures were lies wrapped in motion. But then one of the soldiers pulled something from his pack, a canteen, and held it out toward the nearest woman. She flinched, expecting a blow. Instead, he set the canteen on the floor gently, like placing a flower on a grave, and backed away. He nodded toward it, his expression open, waiting. It took 5 full minutes before one of the women, a girl named Hana, barely 16, who had been taken from her village in Korea 2 years prior, reached out and touched the canteen. Her fingers trembled. She picked it up, unscrewed the cap, sniffed the contents, and took the smallest sip. Water. Clean water. She looked up at the soldier, confusion twisting her face, and he nodded again. He smiled again, and then impossibly he laughed. Not at her, not in mockery, in relief, like he was the one who had been saved. This was not what they had been told would happen. This was not what anyone had prepared them for. To understand the depth of that moment, that collision of expectation and reality, one must step back into the machinery of empire, into the ideology that had built the comfort stations, and into the propaganda that had convinced an entire population that the enemy was something less than human. The system of military sexual slavery employed by the Imperial Japanese Army was not an accident of war. It was deliberate, systematic, bureaucratic. Beginning in 1932 and expanding throughout the 1930s and 1940s, the Japanese military established a network of so-called comfort stations across occupied territories: China, Korea, the Philippines, Indonesia, Burma, and beyond. The term comfort women was itself a euphemism designed to sanitize rape, to transform systematic sexual violence into a logistical category, a line item in a military budget. The women were recruited through deception, coercion, or outright abduction. They were told they would work in factories, serve as nurses, labor in kitchens. Instead, they were imprisoned in barracks and subjected to repeated rape by soldiers who saw them not as human beings, but as tools of war, as necessary releases for the tension of combat, as expendable bodies in service of the emperor. By 1945, estimates suggest that between 50,000 and 200,000 women had been enslaved in this system, though the true number will never be known. Many died from disease, malnutrition, or violence. Others took their own lives. The survivors carried scars, physical, psychological, spiritual, that would never fully heal, and they carried something else: the stories they had been told about the enemy. Japanese wartime propaganda was relentless in its dehumanization of the Allied forces, particularly the Americans. Newspaper articles, radio broadcasts, government leaflets, and military briefings painted a portrait of the white soldier as a savage, a rapist, a demon in human skin. The Americans, they were told, would commit atrocities beyond imagination. They would rape women in the streets, burn children alive, desecrate temples and shrines. Civilian populations were encouraged to commit mass suicide rather than face capture. On Saipan in July 1944, hundreds of Japanese civilians, men, women, children, threw themselves from cliffs into the sea rather than surrender to American forces. They had been taught that death was preferable to the horrors that awaited them. The comfort women had been taught the same lesson. But unlike the civilians, they had no cliffs to jump from. They had only the walls of their barracks and the stories whispered between them in the dark. So when the Americans arrived, they expected monsters. What they found instead were boys from Iowa and Texas and California, many of them still teenagers, who had been taught by their mothers to respect women, who carried photographs of their sisters and sweethearts, who were themselves horrified by what they discovered. The shock was mutual. The American soldiers who liberated the comfort stations were unprepared for what they encountered. They had been briefed on enemy positions, on military targets, on the logistics of jungle warfare. They had not been briefed on this. The U.S. Military Command, in its planning documents and intelligence reports, had no category for the systematic sexual enslavement of women. There was no protocol for how to respond. No training for how to process the sight of 24 women cowering in a barracks, malnourished and traumatized, expecting to be raped and murdered. So the soldiers did what they could. They improvised humanity. Private First Class James Donovan, a 21-year-old from Boston, who had enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor, wrote in a letter to his sister dated February 3, 1945, "We found them in a building near the airfield. I don't know how to describe it, Mary. They were so scared. Some of them were just kids. We tried to tell them we weren't going to hurt them, but they didn't understand English." One of the guys, Martinez, he spoke a little Spanish and tried that, but it didn't help. "So we just started bringing them food. Chocolate, canned fruit. One girl, she took a can of peaches and she cried. She just held it and cried. I don't think I'll ever forget that." The food became a language. The soldiers brought what they had: K-rations, candy bars, tinned meat, crackers, condensed milk. They brought soap and blankets and medical supplies. They brought cigarettes, not to smoke, but to trade for more food from the supply depots. The women, starving and exhausted, ate slowly at first, cautiously, waiting for the trick, the demand, the price. But the price never came. The soldiers simply gave, and then they left. They posted guards outside the barracks, not to keep the women in, but to keep other soldiers out, to protect them while medics were summoned, while translators were found, while someone higher up the chain of command figured out what to do next. And in the spaces between those early moments of liberation, the hours and days before the Red Cross arrived, before the military bureaucracy caught up with the reality on the ground, something extraordinary happened. The soldiers and the women found ways to communicate across the chasm of language and trauma. They used gestures, drawings, facial expressions. They shared cigarettes and photographs. They laughed. The laughter was the most shocking part. The women had not expected laughter. Laughter implied joy, camaraderie, equality. The Japanese soldiers who had raped them did not laugh with them. They laughed at them when they laughed at all. Most of the time, there was only silence and violence, the mechanical transaction of bodies, the assertion of dominance. But these American soldiers, these boys who looked so young and so tired, they laughed the way brothers laugh, the way friends laugh. They laughed when one of the women tried to teach them a Korean word, and they mangled the pronunciation. They laughed when a soldier attempted to demonstrate a dance step and tripped over his own boots. They laughed at shared absurdities, at the strangeness of the moment, at the relief of being alive. One woman, whose name was recorded only as Subject K in a post-war Red Cross interview, described it this way: "I thought they would be animals. That is what we were told. But when they came, they were gentle." One of them showed me a picture of his mother. He pointed to her and then to me and made a gesture like this. She indicated a rocking motion with her arms, like we were the same. Like his mother and I were the same. And then he smiled. I had not seen a man smile at me like that in 2 years. Not since before they took me from my village. I did not know how to understand it. The incomprehensibility of kindness. That was the weapon the women had not been prepared to face. Violence they understood. Violence had become the language of their existence. But kindness, spontaneous, unconditional kindness from the men they had been taught to fear most, shattered the narrative they had been given. It created a cognitive dissonance so profound that some of the women initially refused to believe it was real. They thought it was a trick, a prelude to worse horrors. They waited for the mask to drop, for the Americans to reveal their true nature. But the mask never dropped, because there was no mask. What they saw was what was real. This was the power of the ideological clash at the heart of the Pacific War. The Japanese Empire had built its expansion on a foundation of racial superiority and hierarchical dominance. The comfort women system was a logical extension of that ideology. Women, particularly non-Japanese women, were tools to be used, bodies to be exploited, lives to be discarded. The soldiers who used the comfort stations had been conditioned to see this as normal, as necessary, as their due. And the propaganda that portrayed the Americans as monsters was designed to reinforce that ideology, to suggest that the enemy operated by the same brutal logic, only worse. But the Americans, for all their own contradictions and failings, carried a different ideological inheritance. They came from a nation that, however imperfectly, had built its identity on principles of individual dignity, equality, and freedom. They had been raised in communities where women were mothers, sisters, teachers, neighbors, full persons, not tools. The idea of systematic sexual slavery was alien to them, repugnant to them. When they encountered the comfort women, their instinctive response was not to exploit the vulnerability before them, but to protect it. This is not to say that American soldiers were perfect. They were not. There were incidents of sexual violence committed by American troops in the Pacific, as there were in every theater of the war. Military discipline sometimes failed. Individual men sometimes acted monstrously. But those were violations of the code, not expressions of it. The American military legal system court-martialed soldiers for rape. The Japanese military legal system systematized it. The difference mattered. The women could feel the difference. In the weeks following liberation, as the women were transferred to Red Cross facilities, as doctors examined them and translators recorded their stories, a pattern emerged in their testimonies. Again and again they expressed shock, not at American brutality, but at American restraint. They marveled at the soldiers who brought them food and expected nothing in return. They were bewildered by the medics who treated their injuries with gentleness, who looked them in the eye as if they were human beings. They were astonished by the chaplains who sat with them in silence, who prayed in a language they didn't understand but whose compassion required no translation. One Marine, Corporal David Chen, a Chinese-American translator from San Francisco, spent 3 days helping to relocate comfort women from a station outside Manila. In his diary dated February 20, 1945, he wrote, "Today I spoke with a woman from Shanghai. She asked me why we were being kind to them. She asked if we wanted something. I told her no, we didn't want anything. She didn't believe me. She said that men always want something. I didn't know what to say to that. How do you explain to someone that kindness doesn't always have a price? How do you rebuild a person's faith in humanity when everything they've experienced has taught them that humanity is a lie?" I gave her my chocolate ration and walked away. I don't think I helped, but he had helped. They all had. Every small act of decency, every moment of restraint, every choice not to exploit the power imbalance before them. It all mattered. It didn't erase the trauma. It didn't undo the years of suffering. But it planted a seed of doubt in the ideology of cruelty, a whisper of possibility that the world did not have to operate by the logic of dominance and submission. The symbolic power of American abundance played a crucial role in this transformation. The women had lived for years in deprivation, hungry, cold, denied basic necessities, treated as less than the animals that pulled the supply carts. And then came the Americans, who seemed to have everything in endless supply. Food, medicine, clothing, blankets, soap. The K-ration alone, a small cardboard box containing crackers, canned meat, sugar tablets, instant coffee, and cigarettes, represented more calories and variety than many of the women had seen in a week. The casual generosity with which the soldiers distributed these rations, the offhand way they tossed a chocolate bar to a child or left a pack of cigarettes on a table, communicated something more powerful than any propaganda leaflet could. It communicated that the Americans came from a place of plenty, a society wealthy enough to feed its soldiers so well that they could afford to give food away. And by extension, it suggested that the system that produced such abundance, democracy, capitalism, individual freedom, might be superior to the system that had produced starvation and slavery. One woman, interviewed by an American journalist in 1946, put it simply, "They gave us chocolate. Japanese soldiers never gave us anything, not even rice. Americans gave us chocolate like it was nothing." I thought, if they can afford to give chocolate to us, to women they do not know, women who are not even their own people, then their country must be very rich, or very good, or maybe both. The chocolate became a symbol. So did the laughter. So did the photographs of mothers and sisters carried in wallets and shown with pride. These were the small, mundane artifacts of a society that valued life differently, that organized itself around different principles. And the women, who had been imprisoned within a system that reduced them to their most basic biological function, began to see that another way of being was possible. But understanding this moment requires acknowledging its complexity, its contradictions. The liberation of the comfort women was not a simple narrative of heroes and victims, of good conquering evil. It was messier than that. The American soldiers who freed them were themselves products of a society with its own racial hierarchies, its own history of violence against women, its own blind spots and failures. Many of the black soldiers who participated in the liberation had come from a country where they could not vote, could not drink from the same water fountains as white Americans, could not marry outside their race in many states. Many of the Japanese American soldiers who served as translators had families imprisoned in internment camps back home, their loyalty questioned, their rights suspended. And yet, these men, flawed, complicated, carrying their own traumas, chose kindness when they could have chosen otherwise. They chose to see the women as human beings when they could have looked away, when they could have participated in the exploitation, when the fog of war would have provided cover for almost any act. The women understood this complexity, even if they could not always articulate it. They sensed that the Americans were not perfect, that they carried their own contradictions. But they also sensed that there was something fundamentally different about a system that held imperfect ideals versus a system that had abandoned ideals altogether. The Japanese Empire had built an ideology in which cruelty was virtue, in which the strong had the right to dominate the weak, in which the suffering of others was not merely acceptable, but necessary. The American system, for all its failures, at least held to the ideal that such cruelty was wrong, that the strong had a responsibility to protect the weak, that human dignity was universal. The gap between ideal and reality mattered. The women lived in that gap. They had experienced the worst of what happens when the gap closes, when ideology fully aligns with brutality. And now they were experiencing what happens when the gap remains open, when imperfect people strive toward better principles, even if they don't always succeed. In the months and years after liberation, as the comfort women were repatriated to their home countries, or, in many cases, found themselves unable to return home, stigmatized by their experiences, carrying shame that belonged to their captors but had been placed on their shoulders. They carried with them the memory of that first encounter, the memory of the American soldier who smiled, the memory of the laughter, the memory of the chocolate. For some, it was a source of healing, evidence that goodness existed, that not all men were predators. For others, it was a source of pain, a reminder of what they had lost, of the years stolen from them, of the normalcy they would never reclaim. And for many, it was both. Trauma does not resolve into neat narratives. It echoes and reverberates, reshaping itself over time, refusing to be contained by simple stories of redemption or despair. But in the historical record, in the letters and diaries and interviews, a pattern emerges. The women were shocked because they had been taught a lie. They had been told that the enemy was inhuman, that liberation would be worse than captivity, that death was preferable to surrender. And when liberation came, when they faced the enemy they had been taught to fear, they discovered that the lie was so complete, so thorough, that even the possibility of kindness had been erased from their imagination. The American soldiers were shocked for different reasons. They were shocked because they had not known that such systematic evil existed. They had fought against the Japanese military, had seen the brutality of combat, had buried friends who fell to bullets and bombs. But this industrialized dehumanization, this bureaucratic cruelty, was beyond their experience. It challenged their understanding of what human beings were capable of, what nations were capable of, and it forced them to confront the reality that wars are not fought only on battlefields, that the victims of war are not only soldiers, that the violence of empire extends into spaces they had never imagined. Both groups were changed by the encounter. The women learned that their captors had lied to them, that the world was larger and more complex than the propaganda had allowed. The soldiers learned that war contains horrors that no training can prepare you for, that liberation is more complicated than raising a flag, that sometimes the hardest battles are fought not with weapons, but with the simple, revolutionary act of treating another human being with dignity. In the broader sweep of history, the liberation of the comfort women stands as a footnote, a minor episode in the vast catastrophe of the Pacific War. The official histories focus on battles, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, the atomic bombs, the surrender in Tokyo Bay. The comfort women, if they are mentioned at all, appear as a paragraph, a sidebar, a regrettable but secondary detail. For decades after the war, the Japanese government denied the system's existence, or minimized it, or claimed that the women were voluntary prostitutes. Many of the survivors remained silent, ashamed, unable to speak of what had been done to them. It was not until the 1990s, nearly 50 years after liberation, that survivors began to come forward publicly, to demand recognition, apology, compensation. But for the women who lived through it, and for the soldiers who witnessed it, the moment of liberation was not a footnote. It was everything. It was the pivot point between one reality and another. It was proof that the narratives they had been given, by propaganda, by ideology, by the machinery of war, were not inevitable, not absolute. It was evidence that even in the darkest circumstances, even when systems are designed to crush the human spirit, small acts of decency can break through, can create fractures in the architecture of cruelty. The laughter was such a fracture. The chocolate was such a fracture. The smile was such a fracture. These were not grand gestures. They were not strategic decisions made by generals or politicians. They were small, spontaneous, human responses to suffering. But they mattered because they represented a different way of understanding the world, a different set of assumptions about what people owe to one another, about how power should be wielded, about what it means to be on the side of the right. The Japanese soldiers who had created and sustained the comfort station system operated within an ideology that said power was its own justification, that the strong had no obligations to the weak except those that served their interests. The American soldiers who liberated the stations operated, however imperfectly, within an ideology that said power created responsibility, that strength should be used to protect rather than exploit, that every person possessed an inherent dignity that could not be taken away, only violated. The clash between these ideologies was the deeper war beneath the war, the battle of ideas that would shape the post-war world. And in the barracks outside Manila, in the moment when a young soldier from Boston handed a can of peaches to a starving girl and she cried, that battle was being fought and won in the most intimate, personal way imaginable. There is a danger in romanticizing this story, in turning it into a simple tale of American heroism. The danger is that such simplification erases the women's suffering, treats them as props in a story about American virtue, obscures the complexity of their experiences and the long, difficult work of survival that came after liberation. The danger is that it allows us to forget the failures as well as the successes, the times when kindness did not appear, when soldiers did commit violence, when the institutions failed to provide justice or restitution. But there is an equal danger in the opposite extreme, in rejecting any possibility of moral distinction, in treating all sides as equally guilty, in dissolving the differences between systems and ideologies into a cynical blur where nothing matters and all actions are equivalent. Because the differences were real. The women felt them, the women lived them, and the women testified to them in their own words, in their own time. In a 1993 interview, Kim Hak-sun, one of the first Korean comfort women to speak publicly about her experiences, was asked what she remembered most about the day American soldiers liberated her station in China. She thought for a long moment, and then she said, "I remember thinking they would kill us. I remember being surprised when they did not. I remember one of them giving me water. And I remember thinking, for the first time in 3 years, that maybe I would survive. That maybe I wanted to survive." That shift, from expecting death to choosing life, was not automatic. It was not inevitable. It required evidence that life could be different from what she had known, that the world contained possibilities other than violence. The American soldiers provided that evidence, not through grand speeches or heroic gestures, but through the simple act of treating her as a human being. The epilogue to this story is written in the decades that followed. The comfort women who survived carried their experiences into the post-war world, into the reconstruction of Asia, into the long Cold War struggle between competing visions of society and government. Some of them testified about what had been done to them, becoming activists, demanding justice. Others remained silent, taking their stories to the grave, unable or unwilling to relive the trauma. All of them lived in the shadow of what they had endured, their lives shaped by experiences that could not be undone, scars that would not heal. But they also lived with the memory of liberation, of the moment when the nightmare ended, when the door opened, and the expected monsters turned out to be boys who carried chocolate and photographs of their mothers. That memory did not erase the suffering. Nothing could erase the suffering, but it provided a counterpoint, a piece of evidence that the world was not entirely dark, that cruelty was not the only human response to power, and that mattered. It mattered then in the barracks outside Manila. It matters now in the historical record. It will matter in the future, when new generations try to understand what the war was about, what was at stake, why the outcome made a difference. The Japanese Empire fought for a vision of the world organized by hierarchy, dominance, racial superiority. The United States, for all its contradictions and failures, fought for a vision of the world organized by equality, dignity, freedom. These were not empty words. They were principles that shaped actions, that influenced choices, that determined how soldiers treated the people they liberated. The gap between principle and practice was real, and wide and significant. But the principles themselves were not meaningless. They created expectations, standards, responsibilities. They made it possible to criticize failures, to demand better, to hold people and institutions accountable. The comfort women were shocked by American kindness because they had been taught that such kindness was impossible, that men with power would always abuse it, that the enemy would always be monstrous. When that teaching proved false, when the reality contradicted the propaganda, it opened a space for hope. Not naive hope, not uncomplicated hope, but the stubborn, resilient hope that emerges when you discover that the worst thing imaginable is not the only thing possible. That hope was a form of resistance. It resisted the ideology of cruelty, the logic of domination, the narrative that said suffering was inevitable and meaningless. It insisted that another way was possible, that people could choose differently, that societies could be built on different foundations. And in the end, that might be the most important lesson of the Pacific War, the truth that echoes through the decades from the barracks outside Manila to the present moment. The systems we build matter. The ideologies we embrace matter. The principles we claim to believe in matter because they shape our actions, guide our choices, determine how we treat the vulnerable, the defeated, the ones who have no power to resist. The American soldiers who liberated the comfort women were not saints. They were ordinary men, flawed and tired and far from home, doing their best in impossible circumstances. But they were shaped by a system that, however imperfectly, taught them that every person has dignity, that power creates responsibility, that the strong should protect the weak. And when they encountered women who had been stripped of everything, dignity, freedom, hope, they did not see objects to be used. They saw people to be helped. That recognition, that simple act of seeing another person as fully human, was revolutionary. It was the opposite of everything the comfort women had experienced under the Japanese military. It was proof that the propaganda had lied, that the world contained possibilities other than violence. That liberation could mean more than just the absence of captivity. The women were shocked because they had been taught to expect monsters and found human beings instead. The soldiers were shocked because they had not known that such systematic dehumanization existed. And from that mutual shock, from that collision of expectation and reality, came a glimpse of what the war was really about. It was about the kind of world we want to live in, the kind of world we're willing to fight for, the kind of world where a soldier hands a starving woman a can of peaches and expects nothing in return, where laughter is possible even in the aftermath of horror, where the powerful choose kindness over cruelty because they believe, however imperfectly, that all people deserve dignity. That world is not inevitable. It has to be built and defended and rebuilt again and again by ordinary people making ordinary choices in extraordinary circumstances. The women who survived the comfort stations lived the rest of their lives in that world, carrying their trauma, but also carrying the memory of the day it ended. The day the door opened and the future turned out to be different from what they had been told to expect. That memory is their testimony, and their testimony is our inheritance.